group. For those who are new to UNEG, it's a voluntary network of more than 40 evaluation offices in the UN system. And one of the things that we're trying to promote is the active knowledge sharing among UNEG members. So we organize this type of a webinar to serve as a platform to discuss latest issues in evaluation and development. And today we have a very important and exciting theme for discussion: the lessons from the MDG era, delivering on the world's biggest promise. We have 3 presenters today who have recently completed their evaluations on MDGs in their respective organizations. So we're going to give each one of them about 10 to 15 minutes for their report. And then we would like to open the floor for discussion. Today, we heard that there are at least 130 people registered online for this webinar, so we have a really big crowd. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Before I think we move on to the main presentation, we would like to invite Nick York from the World Bank. He's the Director of Country Corporate and Global Evaluations Independent Evaluation Group for your opening remarks. Nick, please.
Thank you very much, Fumika. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yes, yes.
First, I'm going to reassure you that I'm going to be very brief because I think everybody wants to hear these panelists. But just on behalf of the World Bank and myself, I'd just like to welcome everybody as well and to say pleased to be taking part in one of these events. And we do want World Bank and IEG to play as big a role as possible in helping with the learning and information sharing. And of course, Shaolin will present some of our recent work where we've looked back at the bank's experience, the World Bank Group's experience with the MDGs, and we've learned quite a lot of lessons for ourselves on what is involved in these global development goals and making them actually happen in practice, and the important role of partners at every level in that process. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I'd also like to thank UNEG for making these things happen. I think they're an incredibly important public good and much appreciated. So back to you in New York.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So now I'd like to briefly introduce you to 3 presenters for this afternoon in the order of their presentation, if I may. First is Shaolin Sun, Senior Evaluation Officer at the World Bank Independent Evaluation Group. She's been working at the bank and she has worked on several positions, including work at the IFC, the World Bank, Europe, and then the Central Asia region. She's going to talk about the report entitled The Results and then the Performance of the World Bank Group completed last year. And second, we have Mr. Olivier Cosset from our office, UNDP Independent Evaluation Office. He's the evaluation manager since 2010, and he's recently completed this evaluation of the role of the UNDP in supporting national achievement of the MDGs. And this report was recently discussed at the board in June, the UNDP. And third, we have Ellen Baking, evaluation officer from UNOIOS, Office of Internal Oversight Services. She served as a team leader there for the last 9 years. And today she's going to present her recent thematic evaluation of monitoring and evaluation of the MDGs, which focuses on lessons learned for the post-2015 era. So without further ado, shall we go to Shaolin?
Okay. Thank you very much for the discussion here. So what I'm going to present is a recent IEG annual report, actually, not annual report, annual evaluation or synthesis report of the World Bank Group's performance over the past year. And every year, this results and performance report, we call RAP, has a special theme, and this year's special theme is the MDGs. Therefore, what I'm going to talk about actually is really first part of that report. Okay, so basically we have 5 messages from this part of the review. Actually, before we get into it, I need to clarify that this is not an evaluation as we generally understand that evaluation is really part of a synthesis review. So it's mainly a desktop study with some interviews of the colleagues in Washington, and very selected interviews by phone, but we didn't have field visits. So it's in that context we come up with these 5 key messages. So the first message is, looking at the World Bank, we see that one strength was the bank group was able to integrate the MDGs into its strategies, while at the same time pursuing a broader poverty reduction approach. So very briefly, even before the MDGs were adopted, the World Bank Group's strategies already incorporated the MDG themes. And there are twin pillars of this strategy, which is private sector-led growth and social human development. And that twin pillared approach has been preserved in the following years through the MDG era. Actually, the bank group, despite internal external perceptions of ignoring the MDGs, actually was one of the first to endorse the MDGs. That happened in 2001. In particular, the bank strategies saw 2 key benefits of the framework. One is a results-based framework for assessing results, development impact. Another one is the bank saw the MDGs as providing a contact for donor coordination and country engagement. In the following years, especially 2007, there was a review of this strategy, and also 2010, following the MDG UN MDG Summit, the bank group adjusted its approach. In particular, called for greater focus on institutions and governance, as well as some other issues like global public goods and more attention to appropriate instruments and results management. But one of the things that really got emphasized was institutions and governance in the achievement of the MDGs. In order to guide the World Bank Group's engagement during this period, the bank group developed a selectivity framework and had very outlined the principles for the bank group's engagement at a global level, sectoral level, as well as country level. And this was reflected in the subsequent country strategies, sector strategies, as well as the lending portfolio. Very early on, the bank group, in endorsing the MDGs, also identified some risks, which was the uncertain financial sustainability issues and institutional weaknesses within the country. And very importantly, later on, and these turn out to be the key problems that the bank group, the World Bank Group, encountered in delivering results. And the second message we identified was the World Bank Group was able to provide key intellectual underpinnings to the global development thinking. There are 2 levels of this. One is at a global level, really to, how do I say it, to have input into or drive the thinking process. These are at a higher level, and another level was more direct knowledge support to our country clients. So at a higher level, there were many World Bank's World Development reports that were influential, that were critical in driving both the thinking and especially the World Bank's strategies and our lending approaches. Among these, I would like to cite the 1990 WDR on poverty, and the 2004 the WDR on making services work for the poor. These are very important reports that drove our both global strategy and also especially the sector strategies. And World Bank was also able to use its statistical capacity to help with setting with both the IDGs, International Development Goals, these predate the MDGs, as well as MDGs in terms of setting or finalizing the goals, targets, and indicators. A particular emphasis was put on the quantifiability of the goals. So they really try to narrow down on the goals and the targets that could be measured, and there was reasonable availability of data. A lot of care was given to that. Another area was impact evaluations. The World Bank Group set up different or participated in different initiatives. One is the DIME, Development Impact Evaluation Initiative, that's in our research group, as well as the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. These initiatives led to a really rapid growth of impact evaluations being conducted. However, there I need to mention that IEG evaluation has found that the production of these impact evaluations has not always translated into providing useful inputs to operations. So this is still an area of weakness we see on two tracks of these things. And at a more concrete level, the World Bank Group has also provided a lot of knowledge support, both in terms of research, analytical work, but especially in non-lending technical assistance. This has increased very, very fast. And we also saw a trend which was in the areas or the MDGs that where the bank's lending program hasn't grown or even proportional has declined vis-a-vis the other areas, the knowledge services has increased. So, for example, World Bank's lending increased in MDG 2, 3, 4, and 6. These are precisely areas that World Bank's knowledge services didn't grow, but grew in the other MDGs. So these two are more complementary. However, at the same time, I also need to say that IEG's evaluation has found, at least in the country, at the country program level, the best results were achieved when lending and analysis went hand in hand, not addressing different issues. So this is an area that we're signaling to our operational colleagues to pay attention. So the third key message was that at country program level, the World Bank Group had achieved some success in terms of translating these high-level MDGs into concrete country programs through a country-based model. So both the Monterey consensus in 2002 already emphasized upfront the country leadership in achieving the MDGs. Following that, the bank group really gave a lot of focus, a lot of the emphasis to country focus in our country programs. This was supported by the organizational changes that was initiated in the 1990s. A big component of that was decentralization. So the bank group made a lot of effort to strengthen the country offices and moved, in particular, the country directors closer to the client. So that was a big support for this country-based model. At the same time, even before the MDGs were adopted, there was a period that lots of new instruments were introduced, which proved to be really instrumental for the bank groups to channel bank group lending and knowledge services to the country clients. One of that very important one was the PRSP in either country, but also the HIPIC, the High Indebted the Poor Country Initiative, and multilateral debt reduction initiatives. These were widely used to channel resources to social sectors that proved to be really very important. At the country, World Bank country strategy level, what we found was the MDG themes which is not necessarily the MDG terms were substantially incorporated into the strategies. What that means was that if you look at the country strategies of the World Bank Group, you don't see a lot of MDGs being referred to, but about 80% of the strategy addresses MDG areas. And there is a stable use of MDG indicators for measuring results. This hasn't really increased since the late 1990s to today. It's about 35–38% of the indicators that used in measuring results at the country level that were MDG specific indicators. This hasn't changed. That basically reflected the portfolio where it went. We had 9 country cases that we looked at more in depth, and we found that there is a significant variability between how much the MDGs were incorporated into a country program. Because of the scale of our exercise, it's a desktop review, so we couldn't really get to the bottom of these issues. But at least we could refute a few, hypotheses, which was MDG. At first, we thought MDGs could be less of an issue for middle-income countries or conflict and fragile and conflict-affected countries. We couldn't really find evidence for that. So it was really across the board. Actually, in some of the really high, more developed countries like Brazil, there is a lot more emphasis on the MDGs. This was mainly driven by the country demand. They really wanted the World Bank to help them in the environmental sector, for example. So a lot of the high proportion of the bank's support actually went to some areas that happened to be measured by the MDGs. But what we could see was really that was driven by the country demand. IEG's evaluations highlighted some of the tensions in the work, the World Bank's model. So the fundamental model of the World Bank's engagement at the country level was the very much country-focused model. This has the benefit of being responsive to client needs, but at the same time, we have found that that has made it very difficult to incorporate global and sectoral priorities or some of the issues of the MDGs as a global initiative to make them really work well, integrated into the country-based model. This is a challenge going forward that the World Bank's operational team really need to pay attention to. The next message, then the fourth message, was about partnership. So what we found was the World Bank engaged in partnership for achieving MDGs at various levels, but there were lots of gaps here. So to start with, the selectivity framework that I referred to earlier provided the basic principles, the guidelines for work in partnership with other donors and the country clients. So following that, what we could observe was there was an explosion of trust funds. So there were 3 categories of them. These trust funds offered lots of opportunities for the World Bank to scale up its operations, but at the same time also posed the new challenges of how to make them work the best. So what we found was that there were 3 categories of these trust funds, which was really the cornerstone of the partnerships for the World Bank. So for World Bank executives trust funds, they were very well integrated into the World Bank's regular monitoring evaluation system. So the effectiveness of these projects could be followed, could be assessed easily. Similarly, recipient executive trust funds following the same procedure after the recent trust funds reforms. However, the most important or the trust funds that experienced the fastest growth was what we call the financial intermediary fund. That's both the largest fund in terms of dollar values, but but also in terms of the growth, the pace of growth. These funds, however, were not integrated into the World Bank's operational, the MNE system. Each of these were expressed, they were created to support the specific MDGs. Each of them has its own governance structure and operating modalities, and we have found that integrating the activities supported by these funds into the normal, standard, regular country support program has been very, very challenging.
If I could just add one thing on that, because the DAC Evaluation Network meeting last week, there was quite a lot of interest in a paper which IEG has done on strengthening evaluation arrangements in partnerships, including global funds, and the lessons they've got from that. So IEG will be planning to hold a one-day workshop for partners in the fall on these issues, and we have more information available if anybody is particularly interested in sort of M&E for partnership agreements.
Thank you, Nick. And looking across the sectors for World Bank engagement, we have found that there are very different partnership experiences. For example, in the education sector, this Education for All Fast Track initiative was the main channel for working with partners. It's fully integrated with the bank system and worked really, really well. We know we have the information about how each program is run. In the health sector, it's the financial intermediary funds was really the biggest. They are as big as the overall bank lending put together in the health sector, and especially for special disease related interventions, they are 5 times of the bank's lending envelope to address the diseases. So, and since these are not at all integrated into the bank system, it's very difficult for the bank to see how they work together for us to assess the success of these. So that was a particular challenge. At a country engagement level, what we found, once again, this is part of, some of the constraints of a desktop analysis is that we reviewed the document, and through the document, we could see that PRSP and the HIPIC initiatives played a key role in aligning the donors and the countries together to achieve certain results, but MDGs did not seem to be a major instrument for donor alignment. However, of course, we have to acknowledge that lots of these PRSPs were prepared to support the MDGs, so maybe it's through that channel, but throughout the desk review, we really couldn't see much of a role for MDGs in terms of donor coordination. And IEG's evaluations, as well as the evaluations by other agencies, pointed out some key weaknesses or areas that really need improvement. One is the financing sustainability of these trust funds. These funds tend to have a limited lifespan, and the big question is, after these projects, and can the country sustain the results being achieved? And another issue, of course, is what I mentioned many times, is the integration and coordination with the long-running, the regular programs the World Bank implements in the country. How to integrate these funds that's kind of time-bound into a more longer-term support program. That has always been a challenge. So the final message, which is an area that we identify to be the weakest point for the World Bank groups to support for MDGs, is this, the lack of a clear articulation of a results chain for World Bank groups' goals, approaches, and expected contributions to the MDGs. What we found was, of course, this is not just an issue for the World Bank, but it was acknowledged a problem for the whole MDG framework. Not enough attention was paid to set up a system to articulate what could be expected out of the support. what we saw was that on one hand, that the World Bank Group did make an effort to strengthen the results management agenda. I listed some in this slide, and that starts even before the MDGs were adopted. There was an effort to identify performance indicators that could be measured with baselines and targets. So there is this drive to be accountable for the results. And then over time, there is a greater emphasis to use the MDGs into the results tracking within the World Bank Group, both and start with the IDA at the country program level, and even for our private sector arm of the institution, the IFC, they developed their own and the IFC development goals. These represented a first attempt to measure results among private investment. It's very challenging, but that was a first effort to do that. At the country level, the World Bank did try to build up the statistical capacity of the client countries. However, what we found was that this was never really a key objective in the country program. They rarely figure in the results matrices, and the support was very uneven. And even we found that in some of the poorest countries, the countries that lacked capacity the most, actually the bank's support was the least. Part of this was, again, driven by country demand, but that's clearly a problem for countries that's lagging in data. Actually, the World Bank provided less support in terms of creating the data. So once again, just to repeat that the major weaknesses when we consider everything the bank did over the last 15 years was this is a major area. There was no clear articulation of the results chains, and because the World Bank's support sometimes was not directed in the areas of the MDG measures, the indicators or targets, but more on, for example, creating the systems, the governance. There is a clear need to create intermediate outcomes and link these outcomes to the final, the high-level goals in order to enable us to assess the contribution and impact and draw lessons. Currently, this mechanism is not there, which is really a big handicap. So I think that's all I have to say, and I welcome questions and look forward to a good discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheldon. We will now move on to the next presenter, Olivier.
So we're taking the questions towards the
I think so. Let's finish the presentation first.
So hopefully the presentation will show up on the system. If not, I can use your. Yes, thanks. So I can't just click. I need to click on that arrow, right? Okay. I'll try and do that. Here we go. So this is a presentation, a very short presentation, hopefully, of an evaluation that took pretty much a year of work last year. In 2014, we just presented it at the board early June, and it's been completed pretty much 6 months ago. So it's kind of an old story for us, but I'll try to remember the main points. And I must say also that it is an evaluation. So as opposed to perhaps what Sheldon has presented, she premised by saying this is just a review. We try hard to do an evaluation. So therefore, we have perhaps a little more somewhat slightly negative findings sometimes, I think. So although my colleagues did say to me that I had made for once too positive an evaluation, I don't think that's the case. I think we did uncover quite a few problems. But so basically the scope of the evaluation was very, very wide. We were asked by the executive board to try and explore the contribution of MDGs, of UNEP to the MDGs achievement at country level. And as you might imagine, this is quite a wide remit because a lot of what UNEP does could be seen as contributing to the MDGs in one way or another. So the way we scoped it was to just focus on work that pertained to all the MDGs as a package. So, for example, any work to monitor the achievements of the MDGs as a whole was in the scope, but any work to study the particular progress achieved against one particular MDG, that's outside of our scope. Therefore, any sectorial program were excluded of the scope, and this means that we have, of course, underestimated the UNDP contribution to the MDGs because, say, for example, any work under the environment funded by the JEF is not included in this work, although it would fit under MDG 7. So a quick review of the findings. The UNDP did a number of things in support of the MDGs. The first thing historically was to administer the MDG campaign, the Millennium campaign. So the Millennium campaign, while set up technically a little bit at a distance from UNDP, was still managed by UNDP and administered by UNDP. And that Millennium campaign, the main goal was to try and socialize the goals, if you wish, to try and raise awareness around the world around the MDGs, because the MDGs had been decided here in New York, you know, shortlisted by a small group of people, etc., etc. So this idea that the world out there was not really committed to them, and therefore there was a need for a campaign. So that was one channel. The other channel was the country offices of UNDP themselves, who did some campaigning here or there. The two channels were not connected, interestingly, and we'll come back to that. The Millennium campaign focused on donor countries, namely Japan and in Europe, very few countries there, African countries, and also poor Asian nations. That geographic focus was driven by a number of criteria, such as poverty levels, for example. It was also driven very often by individual contacts, personal contacts. And as a result, that geographic focus was rather narrow, we conclude. One of the work done by the campaign in later years was called the Stand Up for Poverty campaign, which basically said to people around the globe that they should stand up collectively against poverty, physically stand up, I mean. This campaign reached out to hundreds of millions of people. It's probably the most successful campaign managed by UNDP ever in terms of the number of people reached through it, but the problem was the link to policy outcomes. Nobody really understood what difference it would make to stand up against poverty. So many people said, yeah, we stood up, but you know, we don't really get it. We don't really understand the connection here. Some impacts of this Millennium campaign on donors were definitely noted. Also, the campaigning work helped maintain commitments in developing countries towards the goal. It's not very clear that it developed or expanded commitments that was before it's inexistent. I think it just reinforced previously existing commitments. So that's for the campaigning. And then another big role played by UNDP during that period was to the role called the scorekeeper. UNDP was asked by the Secretary General to facilitate or support the production of national MDG reports in all developing countries. And so that has been a very intense area of work since the beginning of the era, with approximately 450 reports produced globally with UNDP assistance. This includes, most of them are national reports. Most countries produce 2 or 3 or 4 reports, but quite a number of countries produce much more than that. And even some countries produced subnational reports, a series of reports at the level of each province or district within the country. So this was a massive area of work for UNDP. I think we can say that it's an operational success in the sense that a lot of work has been done, and those reports were used. Generally, they helped improve data management, especially on poverty. They helped also maintain commitment for the goals nationally, and once in a while they attracted attention to an issue, a development issue that had been neglected up till then. They were quoted in the media as fairly safe and fairly transparent, and so although of course they didn't save the world, those reports served the purpose for which they were intended. One weakness we identified there is the insufficient involvement of UN agencies, in particular specialized UN agencies, in the preparation of those reports. Of course, they were typically involved or invited, but such an involvement was usually weaker than mandated in the guidance documents of UNDP itself. The problem here is that a lot of this development data is actually not so simple to interpret and to analyze. So without the presence of specialized agencies around the table, it's possible that some of those reports may gloss over, weaknesses in data, or may provide perhaps rosy interpretation for the data that's presented. Another issue here, it's less important probably, is the fact that the global reporting system under UNDESA, which Alan will talk about later, I understand, and the country-level reports helped or supported by UNDP were totally disconnected. And UNDP made a try to compile at the global level all the country-level reports in a database and a website that was called the MDG Monitor. It was set up in, if memory serves, in 2007 or 8, and then it was never ever updated after that. And so this is kind of a telling case, if you wish, of an issue that we uncovered in other areas, which is that UNDP pushed the MDGs through its structure to the country office level very well. But when it came to learning from the country level, when it came to compiling information that was arrived at or compiled at the country level, then there was a big weakness. And then finally, the third large area of work was in supporting planning and programming for the MDGs. So that was mainly implemented after 2005, when there was a review summit which highlighted the fact that so many countries had, on paper, committed to the MDGs, but in fact had not done anything to implement them. So there was a big push to try and align development strategies with the MDGs, in particular the PRSPs, of which Xiaolun spoke before. Consisted a focus area in this work, and an entire generation of PRSPs was aligned in this way with the MDGs. And we can discuss exactly what it means to align a PRSP to the MDGs. There were different levels of integration alignment here, definitely, from the mere referential to a more solid use of the goals as targets and indicators. Now, beyond the national level, there was also strong demand for the MDGs in subnational planning. That was very, very strong, in particular in lower middle-income countries and high middle-income countries, in order to address geographic inequalities. That work was supported by UNDP, but not very aggressively or strongly, I must say. UNDP helped cost the MDGs through a research project which was called the Millennium Project. They worked a lot on the macroeconomics of the MDGs, and this work, together with the work of the World Bank, led to what many donors called astronomical figures in countries. But in fact, when you look at those figures and when you look at the amount of ODA that has come to a number of countries during the era, the numbers were not so astronomical, and we conclude that UNDP, with others, has helped make the case that it was perfectly doable macroeconomically to increase ODA. In other words, there was an argument at the time that ODA could not be increased without causing massive disruption in fragile economies, and UNDP sort of argued against that, somewhat successfully. Now we've seen clear programmatic impact in some cases, generally an expansion of social sectors outreach in a number of countries that have aligned their development plans with the MDGs. While we've seen some cases where, therefore, there was an expansion of the social sectors, there were also other cases where we saw UNDP planning work as a little bit superficial, whereby basically, to simplify a little bit, they came in places and sprinkle MDG magic onto plans without thinking that those plans needed to be funded, needed to be implemented in order to translate into something concrete. So we'll come back to that, but there's quite a few cases where we think that UNDP took planning as a little bit of a superficial approach to development. Now, in terms of internal efficiency and management issues within the organization, there isn't much to say there except to say that, in general, the products and guidelines that we've reviewed were well designed and well timed. So, general good quality of the work, if you wish. Country office leadership, by that we mean the reps in country, was a major factor explaining performance at the country level. Another major factor, of course, was the appetite of the national government for the MDG agenda, which also was quite varied. Much stronger, we found it, just as a comment for what Xiaolong just said, we did find in our sample that such appetite for the MDG was much stronger in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. In other words, interest drops when you go into upper middle-income countries and high-income countries. Country office leadership, a major performance factor. Again, echoing a little bit what the World Bank was saying, we found that a lot of trust funds and units were set up in ways that were disconnected from the mainstay of UNDP work in country. And this is an issue because generally they did not add up too much in country. They did not come up with interesting synergies. And finally, as I was saying before, UNDP was much more efficient rolling down tools than learning from the countries. Now, a few words about what this led to, where the MDG is a good idea to start with. Because it's all good and mellow that UNDP contribute to the MDGs, but if the MDGs were the wrong thing to do, then it's not that great. So, generally speaking, most people in the industry, so to speak, consider the MDGs a success. They, for a very small level of outcome or achievement, is that they provided a common language, a safe language, to talk about ODA and development. And from that perspective, the broadening of the now SDGs to issues such as anti-corruption is probably a good thing, because it will allow, hopefully, the international community to talk about anti-corruption in a much more free manner than was the case before. Another outcome is that it provided an agreed and simple metric for development. This, as we've seen, has helped maintain commitments in countries when they were, say, Ethiopia was seeing that Kenya was doing better, and this sort of things. You had a degree of emulation between countries that helped maintain commitment. This led also to more development data, easier to access data, although a lot remained to be done on that front. However, on the minus side, we've seen also in a number of countries that the rush for numbers has led, in some cases, to low quality of social services, particularly in education. In other words, when you go for quantity, well, you sacrifice on quality. And then finally, at the level of development discourse and discussion, there was a pushback. The MDGs helped push back against a narrowly growth-centric view of development and helped fund an expansion of social sectors. However, and that's again a similarity with what the World Bank was saying before, there's quite a few countries who like this MDG social sector expansion aspect, but they are saying nowadays, for example, in the Common African Position, that the MDGs and the expansion of social sectors more generally cannot be sustained without economic growth. And that's fairly obvious when you think of it. It was an area of ODA increase. I think that much is clear, with more aid going to health and education. However, it's almost impossible to disentangle the impact of the MDGs on ODA from the impact of other similar initiatives. And the role of UNDP was minor in this resource mobilization domain. This graph is just to illustrate the growth in ODA during the MDG era. The two lines represent a total ODA disbursement by DAC members. In blue, it's in constant prices, 2012 prices, and in red, it's as percent of world GDP. Whatever the way you dice this, ODA was going down before the MDGs and started to rebound after the MDGs. Now, conclusions and recommendations. In crafting those, we looked at what the future has in store. Of course, the SDGs, as they are shaping up, will be very different from the MDGs. So the degree to which you can use what you've learned in the MDG era for the SDG era, has to be said, is fairly limited. That graph up there is taken from a blog, the poverty blog of The Guardian, and it illustrates at the bottom you have the MDGs, at the top you have the SDGs. As you can see, and they're connected to see which one leads to which one. As you can see, there are many more SDGs than MDGs, and they're touching broader remits. So it's being said, a few conclusions and recommendations can be made for the future. Well, first of all, the conclusions. The basic concepts of the MDGs has largely been validated by experience. Of course, you can always criticize them as you can criticize anything, but by and large, we come to the conclusion that the basic concepts and strategies were validated. UNDP has rolled out an impressive set of tools in support of the MDGs, and that were generally of high quality and well-timed. A third conclusion is about the limited involvement of specialized UN agencies. That emerged as a weakness not only in the MDG reports, but also in planning, also in the MDG acceleration framework, which we haven't talked about today, but is part of planning. So it's an issue that's systemic, and perhaps the reason for it is that UNDP was so dominant at the beginning of the MDG era on the MDG dossier, if you wish, that it sort of crowded out specialized agencies. Another explanation is that for specialized agencies, the MDGs were at the beginning perceived as a gimmick. They were so simple that they were seen as simplistic. In any case, UNDP sized on them early on, and specialized agencies didn't, and this led to problems in the end. There was also an excessive attention to formal planning by UNDP per se, without thinking through realistic means of implementations. And what we've seen in the countries that we've reviewed is that the eruption of crisis, for example, accounts for half of all the cases where there was a nice little MDG plan that was never implemented. In fact, we find that in more than half the cases where UNDP supported the alignment of national development strategies with the MDGs, there was no implementation of that plan. So a lot of planning for nothing, if you wish, and that's where we're trying to say that, okay, now planning is certainly a good avenue, but we need to take into consideration that not all planning will lead to results. We need to take into consideration the factors that affect effectiveness of planning. So that's one of the recommendation 4, focus planning assistance on processes that have good implementation prospects. Now, it's easier said than done. Of course, when you are at a particular time, you don't know if a planning process will lead to a result in the future, but you have to make a call of whether it's a superficial or unlikely to result in anything type of process, or whether it's a genuine process. I mean, in the sample, we find that UNDP supported an MDG strategy in Somalia in 2011. I mean, how realistic is that? For all sorts of reasons. There's plenty of other things happening in Somalia than the MDGs. So we call on UNDP to be a little more cautious there. Then the first recommendation is to finish off the country reports with a round of reports to finish the period. The second recommendation is that in the future, UNDP should, of course, do sectorial work that resonates with the SDGs. UNDP works on governance, works on crisis, and these two aspects are well covered in the SDGs. But we argue that there is still a role for at least somebody, and we think UNDP can play that role, to provide advice at the level of the entire agenda, because it's all nice and mellow to have 16 or 17 goals, but they cannot be achieved in isolation. One leads to another, they're all connected. So we think that somebody should do that work of trying to look at congruence and coherence among them. The roles that UNDP played during the MDG era, we didn't find them grossly inappropriate or anything like that. So we think they should be continued while enhanced with greater work with the other UN agencies. And finally, we did find a bit difficult during our evaluation to assemble information in a systematic way. We find very little in terms of systematic compiled information, and we did find also that this was perhaps related to the fact that the cadre of advisors that had been working on the MDGs have often changed with rapid rotation of staff. And so for the next era, we recommend to maintain a stable cadre of advisors and also to document country-level work in a much more systematic way than before. That's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Olivier. Now we move on to the third presenter, last but not least, Ellen, please.
Hello, everybody. I think because we are all eager to have the discussion, I can be brief. Which might be a first, but I'll try. So just to start, and I'm going to skip over some of the methodology and other things like that. If people are curious, we can talk about it in the discussion period. But just to start, this I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you. This was an evaluation whose the overarching purpose of which was to assess the effectiveness of the MDG monitoring and evaluation framework, with a focus, like the title says, on learning lessons for the post-2015 era. So that was our overarching objective. During the inception phase, we identified a need to map out the different components of the MDG M&E framework. What we've got up here in this slide is as you may recognize it from the report, it is our mapping of the components that make up the framework. And as was just pointed out with regard to the UNDP work, there really is a need for more systematic kind of orientation. And to take it even a step further back from one of the things that was said in the context of the World Bank's work, I think it was pointed out that there was no clear results chain. Well, not only that, there was no clarity about who was even involved that we could find significant documentation on. So this is just to show that, you know, from the point of view of the UN perspective, that you've got the intergovernmental bodies at the top, some of the global components here, including, you know, just as a for instance, because it's a little hard to read up there, but for instance, the Chief Executive Board, CEB, engaged in some work on MDG country reviews. Over at the other end, on the regional side, if this was a bit wider, higher in terms of the font, you would be able to see the country reports that UNDP is engaged in. There are a variety of regional reports done by the UN Regional Commission. So it's pretty telling that we had to start our work by kind of going around. Everybody that we interviewed, key players, said to us, well, we don't really know what the framework is. So we started calling it, you know, the framework in quotes. So that would be kind of our first point. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to have you do that. Thank you. I'm going to jump, as I said, right over the methodology. These are the 8 lessons learned. Perhaps I won't read them all since they're up there, and I'll just jump around, but they're very much in line with a lot of what's been said already. So I think if you were to triangulate the 3 evaluations or the 2 evaluations and the synthesis review we talked about today, the good news would be that there's a lot of synchronicity. Just as an example, lesson, let's see, 3 kind of picks up on a concept that was referred to in the UNDP work, and that is that here it's a little more specific, but that there needs to be clarity about who the expert group that follows the process is. And in fact, this interagency and expert group on MDG indicators was a real strength, I think, in the process. But you could expand that out to say there has to be more continuity that reaches out a bit more widely, not just at the global level, but then to the regional and national level. Again, I don't know that I want to walk through all of these. Maybe just to read the last 3 to give a little more flavor. We found that monitoring information needs to be sufficiently accessible. Our data showed, too, that there was a provision for rigorous evaluation on the achievement of progress that wasn't being fulfilled. And then found data showing that when differences exist in stakeholder views of accountability, this becomes fairly relevant in terms of monitoring and evaluating, that's okay, effectively. No, not surprising, actually. So the next slide, please. These next 2 slides perhaps go together a bit. This is OIOS's attempt to depict at a conceptual level how evaluation has the potential to be a bridge between monitoring and accountability. And it's fairly, well, I believe it's somewhat self-explanatory. You can see all the different levels there. And then the idea that if you've got some evaluation loops or cycles, that can have a positive effect on accountability across all of the dimensions, global, regional, national, and local. And I'll just go to the next slide. Taking that down to one more level of detail, and again, picking up on some of the things that have been said with regard to the World Bank and UNDP work, here we sought to show, in maybe slightly more confusing fashion, but to show a bit more detail and show some of the components that might be a part of an ongoing evaluation framework. So what's being depicted here is that perhaps there is reason to consider annual monitoring that feeds into, just as an example, 5-year cycles where you've got at every 5-year juncture comprehensive meta evaluation or synthesis, however one wants to look at it. And again, this is at a fairly high level, but this was very much missing. In fact, as part of our evaluation, we attempted to identify where all the MDG evaluations were, and of course that's challenging because you could argue that everything is an MDG evaluation, but nevertheless it was very, we actually had to sort of abort that analysis and just say that everything is very much in an ad hoc manner, and it would be very hard for anybody, even looking into a particular MDG, to have any sense of how could they get a picture overall of where we stood at any given point with regard to success. Take us to the last 2 slides. This is the draft recommendation that we put forward. For those that don't know, our reports typically go before an intergovernmental body, which is the Committee of the General Assembly, called CPC, and we recommended to them that as part of the ongoing deliberations, that there should be consideration to having the Secretary General formulate an overarching strategy and action plan, which would in short support coherent, coordinated monitoring and evaluation of achievement towards the MDGs. And again, some more specifics there, which I won't take the time to read through. But I can just tell you that we can go to the next slide, in a somewhat rare position when you're an evaluator at the UN to be able to tell you that in contrast to the UNDP report, which is 6 months past, this report is very much live. I just came from the CPC session where they're still talking about this report, and so I thought I would take the opportunity to share it somewhat confidentially because these are ongoing deliberations, but they're nearing the end. So it's a little bit interesting for us to note as evaluators that a lot of their discussion has been around, not surprisingly for those of you that are familiar with CPC, a lot of their discussion has been around whether or not this OIOS evaluation report went beyond its intended mandate. The point being, should OIOS be presenting lessons learned for consideration when the post-2015 intergovernmental deliberations are underway? Just always something interesting to keep in mind. I mean, our mandate is to be relevant, so to have done this without that orientation seems a bit questionable from our perspective, but one does, as we knew this would be the case, we were a bit careful with our language, and they have, in fact, become quite receptive. And after some discussion about the terminology, why is there accountability terminology when the deliberations have moved on to follow-up and review, et cetera, they ultimately do look like they're going to accept our recommendation, which originally they were saying was very premature. What was the word that they said? Was something more than premature, a very strong synonym for premature. But they now are noting, prejudges, that's what it was. The draft recommendation was being considered by some member states to be prejudging possible outcomes, but it now looks like they will note it, not definitively endorsing, but noting it. So it's just an interesting lesson because we had debate. Errol was my chief, and those who don't know it, during this evaluation, and we had some debate about whether or not we should have a recommendation. And Errol, I thought, made the interesting point that my original, I'm kind of risk adverse, so my original thing was, oh, we're going to get in trouble, they're going to slap our hands, let's not put it in and let's leave them receptive to the rest of the information in the conclusion, et cetera. And Errol's being a bit more of a creative soul and a risk taker, said, no, let's go ahead and put the recommendation in because it will engage people in dialogue. And in fact, I think he was right. We did see more engagement because we took that little bit of a risk, but it's just regardless of what your intergovernmental body is or how you do your work, I think it's a little bit of an interesting lesson learned for us in terms of balancing relevance and concerns about receptivity. So I'm going to end there. This is the other piece just had to do with where the other opportunities might exist for UNEG.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ellen. Let's take the time. We have about 25 more minutes we can use for a general discussion. Now at this time, I'd like to invite Harold Housig, who's our Deputy Director of IEO, Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. He's currently with us, but then, as Ellen mentioned, he used to work for UN OIOS as the Chief of Inspection and Evaluation Division. And he's also worked at the World Bank, so he's in a really good position to give us to kick off this general discussion and perhaps a question and answer session. Errol.
Thank you very much, Famika. First, there's lastly on your point of introduction. No, I haven't actually worked at the World Bank. I worked for some time consultant to the World Bank. Now, kicking off the questions and discussions, rather than pick up on my former association and role with the IOS, I'm going to throw out the contributors, all three, the proposition that in the three respective exercises, we are, for all practical purposes, in a certain manner of speaking, dealing with how the respective organizations dealt with the MDG agenda. None of the reports actually address any kind of association between the respective organizations and the actual progress against the MDGs itself. I know for so many good reasons the sort of causal associations are presumably intractable, but if that leaves us with what would your answer be to the proposition that the MDGs would have been as much progress against the MDGs whether our organizations existed or not? Once the agenda had been set, it marshaled a certain attention to the issue, but arguably, well, the progress that was made had nothing to do with any of the actions that our organizations did. Some people would argue, could it be that we're leaving that question to be a proposition of faith, or respectively a badge of organizational loyalty? If we don't answer that question, who does?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Errol. Does anyone, first of all, the three presenters want to comment on Errol?
Maybe I could take a shot at that. We really try to bridge that gap, if you wish, between the work of UNDP and the achievement of the MDGs. We did try hard to try and show a causal contribution there. I don't think it was wise to even try. One of the persons in BDP to whom I presented this work commented on our courage, and I think that meant, in fact, what a fool you are even to try that, because there are so many different factors that come into play that it's evidently quite impossible to do. One thing I can say that I'm convinced about after this evaluation, I'm not saying it's proven, I'm saying I'm personally I came to that conclusion. I'm convinced that the evidence I have, are sufficient to convince me at least, is that the MDG agenda would probably have been totally forgotten, if not for a number of UN agencies, in particular UNDP's role in trying to support them. And I'm saying this because I've seen at least one country, or even two countries in our sample, where it was forgotten, until UNDP started to say, hey, let's do something about them around 2007 or 8. So, there's been many lofty goals in the past set up in many conferences, and a lot of them have been forgotten. One of the lessons from the MDGs is you don't do these things, just like I was saying, you don't do planning without looking at means of implementation and how to translate that into reality. One of the lessons of the MDGs, I think, era is you don't create a lofty global agenda if you're not able to keep campaigning and banging on your drums and trying to do something about them. At least the UNDP has done that. Again and again and again, over the period, it has drummed the beat of the MDGs. That's already something. Now, of course, as everybody who knows of it, this dossier says, China is responsible for a good chunk, something like 25%, or I don't want to say something wrong, but a very big chunk of progress against the first MDG, and they did not formally approve the MDGs or adopt the MDGs until 2010, 2011. So it's perfectly possible to achieve the MDGs without referring to them, because of course they're not new themes. They reflect past ideas and past agendas. It's not like they are anything new, in fact. No? At least that would be my answer.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to pass just to Lisa Thomas first. I'd be interested to hear other points. I think you made a good point.
Oh, okay. Nick or Shaolin?
Yes. Okay, I will try. This is an interesting question, of course, and I think it's a question on everybody's mind, is how much as an institution the World Bank Group contributed to the MDGs. Unfortunately, actually, for our exercise, we specifically avoided that question for some very specific reasons. Well, the first of all is the nature of our exercise really doesn't allow that. It's very limited time bound, and it's a desk study. To answer some question like that, of that magnitude, it's just impossible, so we don't want it to. It really is the scope of the exercise doesn't allow that. Secondly, I don't think the IEG has the appetite really to devote resources to try to answer that question, because this is something ultimately we don't think we will be able to answer anyhow, because MDGs are such high-level global goals, while the bank's operations are at a much lower level, and in the large scheme of things, it's such a small player in the whole universe of what needs to be created in order to achieve the MDGs. So I don't think we will be able to do that. And finally, this is something I mentioned in my presentation, is that lots of the interventions of the World Bank can be called enabling environment. For example, in the health area, the World Bank purposefully did not address the disease, which are measured by the MDGs, but is more focusing on the health systems and the financing, sustainability. These issues are critical, but it's hard to link them directly to the MDG measured results. So this is one reason why we emphasize to articulate the results chain. It's okay for the World Bank to go after some intermediate outcomes, some other issues, health financing system, for example, governance system, for example, but then there should be some articulation of how that goal links or contributes to the high-level goal. But without it, for the MDG area, there was no such articulation, and ex post, we don't want to impose on the results chain and then try to see did they achieve something they didn't even set up to achieve. So that's another reason. And but going forward, this is a suggestion and implication for our colleagues in operation to do that, so that we can continuously assess whether or not we are achieving our declared objectives, and if not, what to do. But when it is completely absent, ex post, we cannot really impose the goals or a measurement system to see if they met the target or not.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I think at this time we'd like to open the floor for the general sort of discussion with the audience. I understand that there are a couple of people who are online who have questions, and then also I believe we have a few in the room as well. You go to this question. You was first. What's his name? David Akana, are you online?
Oh yes, I'm online. My name is David Akana, and I work for the Independent Development Evaluation function of the African Development Bank. Just listening to the colleague from UNDP, I must say that it is a little disheartening to listen to him speak, in part because I think in this part of the world there is a lot of hope with the SDGs. We are hoping that this could significantly ameliorate the poverty situation in this part of the world. But listening to him say that setting the goals is one thing, and of course measuring them and implementing them is another, and then using lessons from the MDGs, I tend to be a little bit worried. So the question is, from your perspective, what do you think with respect to, do you think in setting the SDGs, have we learned any lesson with respect to measurement and making sure that we are learning the lessons from the MDGs in terms of implementing the SDGs? I know there's quite a good number of groups at the UN that have been working in terms of, tightening the outcomes, the indicators, and the targets at this point. So the question is, do you think we've learned sufficiently on that, and is there a likelihood that we would be able to measure the SDGs a lot better and then have better outcome on the ground?
A couple more questions. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Elhan Seyfiamdis. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. I had 3 questions, if I may. One of them relates to the question that was just raised by, I'm sorry, I forgot, by Errol. And I think that maybe the way to go about this is to formulate the question differently. I understand that this is obviously a way of trying to understand what it is that the institutional impact of these various organizations is in terms of achieving the goals. But perhaps we should be asking the individual country offices as well as the governments within the countries to what extent the MDGs have been impacting them. And the reason for why I bring this up is because I was at an event yesterday where the permanent representative of Kenya was telling us how she was very disheartened by the way we were talking about the MDGs because they had an actual impact in her country. And there were many, I'm sorry, Rwanda, excuse me, Rwanda. And how, that, so the experience that she had on the ground was quite different. But that was just a comment, if I may. I had one question to Shaolin at the World Bank, and my question was with regards to point 5, where you mentioned the weak data and the countries where there has been kind of a lack of data, the World Bank has been less active. And I was wondering to what extent this kind of data-driven approach has been kind of presenting an obstacle to the kind of work that we do, in fact, in these countries, and the extent to which the World Bank has been getting involved within with its work within the different countries with its work on MDGs. And a second question I had was with regards to point 1, and I think you made the you mentioned how the World Bank has always been or had already previously, prior to the MDGs, been involved in kind of MDG work, and I was wondering to what extent you can disaggregate where they have been more impactful than other areas. Which goals have they already been working on versus others, and to what extent has this different goals and targets impact that continued work? And my question to Olivier was about the limited involvement of the other organizations, the various agencies. And I was wondering to what extent that has to do with the fact that the MDGs were seen as a UNDP agenda. So the whole idea of the UNDP being the scorekeeper, the campaign manager, one of the things that we know is that post-MDGs, the budget of UNDP goes up drastically. It was going down, and after that we see go up drastically throughout the 2000s. And I'm wondering to what extent that was seen as a sign of, okay, UNDP has been given this mandate, and there is no reason for us to be getting as involved as we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shong Bill from IOM. This is very interesting, and thank you very much for inviting us. It's the first time I've heard about the MDGs and SDGs. I find very interesting stuff from a monitoring point of view and monitoring and evaluation. My question is for Olivier. Your evaluation, to what extent did it impact the formulation of the SDGs? Who reads your report? How did that have an impact on policy forming for the SDGs? That was very interesting.
Okay.
Maybe I can take this one first.
Yes, sure.
Nobody reads them. No, I mean, I don't know exactly who reads them from cover to cover. Definitely, that would be a small number. I think we're trying to make those reports useful by delivering the message through many different ways. But if you look at the way we are mandated to work here in the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP, our mandate is to advise UNDP, right, and the UNDP board. It is not, of course, to advise the members, the member states, or to advise the Secretary General. So, no, the SDGs were not impacted by this evaluation, because we don't have any mandate to advise anybody at that level. That's one. Second reason, the SDG discussion started in 2012, very, very early on, and it's been going on since then. And so we did our evaluation in 2014, fairly late in that process. So I think that would explain why. No, of course, there's no impact. And then tying up with the question by the gentleman from the African Development Bank on are we learning from the lessons of the MDGs in the SDG? Now, I'm not qualified to answer that broad question other than by giving my opinion, because, again, we are mandated to look only at what UNDP has been doing. But from what I can see, there's very little lessons learning from one era to the next. I know this may sound a bit disheartening, but to me, it looks like since the MDG, I mean, this global agenda called the MDGs, were somewhat reasonably successful in obtaining the approval of different partners and actors, and since there's some general good feeling about their utility in the discourse, in the negotiation of aid, etc., suddenly people want to do even more with the SDGs, and therefore they have in fact forgotten, in my own personal view, I'm not speaking for UNDP here, the people who are discussing these things, I believe, are forgetting one very simple principle that presided over the MDG formulation, and that principle was to say we need something simple. We have all these lofty discussions in Geneva, in Washington, in New York, in London, or Paris, or wherever, and, you know, all these agreements are signed and declarations made, but the common man, the common person on the ground does not understand any of it and does not trust any of it. And so one way of fighting back a certain skepticism vis-a-vis aid, vis-a-vis ODA, etc., was precisely to boil down all this complex discussion to a very simple, clear-cut list of goals. And this worked. Now, I'm afraid that we've forgotten that idea. I'm also a bit disheartened by listening to Alan. I'm wondering whether there isn't among member states a certain degree of nervousness about a stronger M&E framework. After all, when you think of the MDG era, you know, for 15 years, the development debate has been dominated by those MDGs. Now, it would seem like logical that there would be a large number of evaluations at the end of this period to look at the value of this work, no? And when we started this evaluation, we did try to reach out to other UN agencies, at least, to try and do that together, and there was very little appetite at the moment. And I will finish with a question of Elham on the MDG being a UNDP agenda or perceived as UNDP agenda. There was certainly, and I don't think I'm releasing any secret there, there was certainly a degree of frustration, in particular in UNICEF, but also in other specialized agencies. But UNICEF had been at the forefront of all these discussions. You have to remember that the Child Summit was, if you wish, the first time that a global agenda was agreed upon through a UN summit of some sort. And so that provided a little bit the blueprint for the later summits. And so UNICEF had a very strong engagement in that discussion at the global level. And yes, I'm certain, because some people from UNICEF told me, that there was a degree of resentment in 2001 when the Secretary General nominated UNDP as the scorekeeper and campaign manager for the MDGs. And indeed, that may explain a little bit this problem. I don't think it's the only reason, honestly. I think also very often in practice, after 2-3 years had passed, you know, the UNICEF was totally on board and quite a few other agencies. But when you had to do an MDG report and you had to, you know, beat that deadline, well, if you had to do a real negotiation and discussions with the UNICEF and the FAO and the WHOs of this world, you would have needed 2 more months, and well, people cut corners, and they decided that it was more expedient and fast to do it with a light touch consultation. And we're saying that, well, maybe it was expedient and maybe it worked, but now with the SDGs, definitely it's not going to work, because the agenda is so much more complex that we will need all the help we can get to monitor it.
Yes. Thank you. Can I just make a couple comments? One related to the question here. Thank you for the questions, but also picking up on a lot of what you've said. Just maybe starting off with your question, I think you bring up a very important point about should we not be asking individual countries, and this is particularly, it's pertinent to me, just having gone to just, you know, we only did as a case study, we went to Tanzania, but we spoke to all the players there, the government officials, the NGOs, the think tanks, the whole range of stakeholders, certainly the whole UNDP country team, and we learned a lot. And I'm not saying that the typical case, we actually chose it because it was seen by many to be a good example of where there was traction and there was an appetite. But I think it just brings, and you spoke to the diversity in terms of the degree of appetite, and I think we very much saw that when we looked at the documents and looked at case, you know, engaged in that case study and then looked at other related engagements. So it's a really important point. It's particularly important because one of the main ideas, and maybe where there is now some pushback against monitoring and evaluation, is in the countries that are saying, look, this is supposed to be, this should be a national-led agenda. It shouldn't be a top-down. Coming back to your comments, which we certainly heard that when we heard it everywhere, that the MDG agenda felt like it was pushed down on the countries. That's, I think, common knowledge, although it's an overgeneralization. But so now the idea from the very start, since 2012, when the negotiations have started on the post-2015 agenda, the idea has been that needs to be entirely flipped. And every stakeholder we spoke to at the country or the regional level was very much, that's where they started their conversation with us. This is what needs to change. But it raises a lot of challenges, right? I mean, when you had something that worked well because it was simplistic, and sometimes the reporting happened on time or well because there was the choice to narrow things, which is not a positive or negative choice, really. It has pros and cons. It has costs and benefits. But now you're talking about an agenda which is intended to be universal, which is very complicated and complex. And you're talking about having country-level ownership. And then you've got, which I didn't touch on because I wanted to be very brief, but there are big capacity issues here, both in terms of statistical capacity at the country level, even in the countries that had the largest appetite and the best resources. Those are huge issues. So just, I think these are what the comments you've made and the question you've asked, I think are very key comments, and it's a very key question at this juncture in terms of the post-2015 agenda. However it is determined by the member states, these are going to be very pertinent issues.
I think there are a couple of questions to Shaolin. Shaolin, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. So I will try to answer the questions directly just to me. One is about the point number 5 about data. Indeed, this is the conclusions that we drew from the in-depth review of 9 countries, and we did find that definitely, first of all, it is critical to have accurate data. That's absolutely necessary to make a good policy, to have a plan, to design a sensible program and to implement it correctly, and continuously learn from what's going well, what's not going so well, and how to adjust. Without data, that's impossible to do. Actually, I was just, we were discussing the program in Cape Verde, for example, this morning, and there, bank and IMF have been running programs for a number of years without the basic data on the GDP growth, which turned out to be false, and that really shakes the whole foundation of that intervention, a series of interventions. So that should have never happened like that. So yes, data is very important, and it's lacking in many of the countries we work in, and the bank's assistance, as I mentioned, has been very uneven, especially seems to be particularly lacking in the poorer or lagging countries, and that's very very bad and need to be urgently addressed. Yes, so that is a big lesson from, and especially I think the idea is to continuously learning from failure, learning from past mistakes, learning from past experience. Without reliable data, that's just not possible. And so going back to slide 1, the question was in the past, so before the MDGs were adopted, the bank has already changed its orientation, and I think the interest was a bit more what that meant. So indeed, starting from the 90s, the World Bank group, the development thinking in general is that focusing on growth, it's critical, but that's not important. That's not enough. So the bank had this purposely reoriented to give them a lot more emphasis on the social sector, so empowering poor people, empowering people in general to participate in development. And this is reflected in the bank's work program. For example, the lending to social sectors increased from 5% in the early 1980s to 20% in the late so from 5% to 20% between the early 80s to late 90s. So we're talking about a period before the MDGs. You could already see a fourfold increase in the bank's attention lending to the social sectors. And this trend has continued after the MDGs were adopted. And there are particularly, in our report, we have a lot more data. And if you're interested, we also refer to a link that has the background notes that's in the annex on our website in IEG. So a lot more resources went to IDA.
Uh-oh. A 5-minute grace period.
WebEx subscription is due.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Shaolan?
She can hear us.
Point at
Oh, there we go. What's that? Okay.
We're back. We can hear you.
Yeah.
I think we got the gist.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shaolan. We're almost up. Actually, we've come to the time already. But then I know we have two more people for questions. One person, one online. Francesca Garcia, are you still there? Yeah. Okay. Okay. If she's not there, then Tina. That's the last.
Okay, thanks. I have 3 quick questions, one for Olivier, one for Ellen, and one for all of us. Olivier, you spoke a little bit about coordination, just mentioning that it's necessary. I'm wondering, so that was part of the scope of the evaluation. Could you say a few words about coordination at the country level and how it has been, and what you, sorry, I didn't introduce myself, Tina from UNICEF's evaluation of it. So what UNDP's role has been in that, and how effective it has been in coordinating efforts at the country level. Regarding data, one of the things I often hear as a potential issue with the MDGs was that it didn't give specific attention to specific subpopulation, and data wasn't sufficiently disaggregated, and that may be also one of the reasons for why maybe buy-in from specialized agencies was low, right? So I was wondering if you could say a few words about this issue and how what we can learn from that for the SDGs. And so I'm thinking gender, I'm thinking youth equity agenda. And the question for all of us, I'm just wondering what UNEG's role could be in making sure that the SDGs get evaluated in a more coherent and comprehensive way.
The last one will be for Bhumika.
Well, you know, I've recently joined the UNEG Secretariat, and I'm still catching up with my learning of what exactly UNEG has been doing and then will do. But then there are a lot of activities to try to ensure that we integrate somehow evaluation into the whole post-2015 discussion. I can't say I can talk about it in detail, but certainly it's one of our activities as part of our work plan this year. I think I have to stop without going too much. Yes.
On coordination at country level, what we did find was that, you know, as you must know, UNDP has a sort of mandated role for the UN system. And then there's also in a number of countries, not in all of them by far, a role in terms of coordinating the broader donor community. It's fairly obvious that the MDG agenda reinforced that both roles, but mainly the first. The degree to which UNDP was able to reach out to donors during the MDG era, and when I say reach out, I mean coordinate with them and not only get money from them, but engage them in a discussion about where to, what to do, what to fund, where to fund, etc., etc. So true coordination, not just resource mobilization. The degree to which UNDP was able to contribute to that discussion with donors was, I think, below expectations, definitely below expectations. So it's, to come back to Alan's question, it's true that there's been a rise in the funding for UNDP during that period. I doubt it's immediately and 100% certainly not related to the MDGs. The MDGs might have played a role there, but let's not overemphasize them, because I don't think that if you take out a few big projects like the 20 millions for the Millennium Villages, for example, and things like that, you won't see much in terms of resource mobilizations for the MDGs. There isn't much out there. And it's a problem, but in countries where UNDP was able to reach out to and coordinate well with donors, we saw very good results in the end. Say Ethiopia is a case at hand where UNDP has a key role in donor coordination with the World Bank and others, but does fulfill that role really well, and it did help. It's one piece of the puzzle, but it did help in aligning a lot of funding streams towards the MDGs in Ethiopia, resulting in an expansion in social services in Ethiopia. So that was a good case, and then there were other less good cases, such as Madagascar and Mali, where, you know, similarly you had an MDG aligned plan, you had an appetite by the nation to adopt the MDGs and work on them. And but you had absolutely no such connection between UNDP and donors. Very weak connections, very weak positioning of UNDP in its coordination role with donors, and as a result, very little funding for such plans. So, I mean, as a result, in those two cases, we think it's related. So, yeah. I think UNDP did some decent work in UN coordination, in short, with the caveats that not all agencies were initially interested. But on donor coordination, it's below expectations.
I can make a couple points to the question that you had. Might pull a couple things from your report, but yes, you're absolutely right that the attention to subpopulations and the lack of disaggregated data, and I would even add the lack of timely data, has what we saw as a contributing problem too in terms of buy-in and credibility in some instances. So I think you're right that those things have to be worked on among some others if you're going to get higher buy-in at the national level. A few statistics that we put in, this was our lesson number 4, that monitoring activities need to be sufficient in terms of their coverage, their disaggregation, the disaggregation of the data, and also timeliness. And just a few statistics from that. We had a reliable source that indicated that only 11% of developing countries had produced data on maternal mortality. That's a very small number. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy data to collect, but it's not it's not among the most obtuse data that you're after. So we thought that was fairly telling, and also in terms of the disaggregated data, real gaps in terms of data based on gender, wealth quartile, age, disability, population group, localized inequities, as the starting point. We queried, one of our methods, which again I did not go into, was to do a survey of all the interagency and expert group members. This is about IAEG on MDGs, and many of you probably know it. And so these are people, you know, in the know, who are statisticians primarily, et cetera. And over half of those respondents disagreed with the statement that the Millennium Development Goal monitoring and evaluation framework had supported strong incorporation of disaggregated data. So the statisticians said, no, it's not happening. And that's, you know, they have a vested interest in saying what was working since they were working hard on it. So, yeah, you're right.
All right. Unfortunately, we have passed the time already, so we're going to have to close this webinar. But thank you very much for, first of all, to the 3 presenters for their wonderful presentations and report. I think for those of us who are going back to our organization, hopefully this discussion was useful, something for the food for thought. I'd like to also thank your General Hauge for their participation today. Just a final sort of announcement, but then at the UNEG Secretariat, we try to organize this type of a webinars. So if you, anybody from the audience today who would like to present their work, evaluation reports, and use this as a platform, do let us know, send us the proposals, and we'll be happy to work with you. So with that, thank you very much for everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.